Tonight's discussion is about value. However, you walk before you can run, and if I just keep the value all the same, no difference in the tonality, I can go for more complicated stuff. If I start making the values different now, then I've got complicated value, I've got complicated form, and I could quickly get frustrated with the process. So I want to point that out. I just react essentially to dark and light that strikes my eye, not even shadow and light. I also don't want a principle that will be ineffectual when I'm in a full light situation, when there's not very much shadow, like in a Holbein drawing. Holbein is just such an incredible artist. There's very little shadow in those drawings, and I still want a system that can work for me in those situations. So I say dark and light. I am using a Mono 100H today. It is a harder lead so I can make lighter lines, and it is a lead that will give me the clarity of shape, because remember what we're talking about in shape here is a very kind of accommodating graphic formatting of what you're dealing with. I hate to sound wordy, I know sometimes I get into that category, I'm certainly guilty of that, but what I'm trying to go for in this is a phrase that I know we've heard quite a bit, that I've co-opted for tonight's discussion, and the phrase is, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." What I'm trying to do with that phrase is to say that if I go after absolute perfection in the shapes, I'm not going to want to touch this drawing anymore. I'm not going to have any wherewithal to pursue further development. But if I can build it up in some kind of way that has characteristics of intrigue, little interesting, innovative ways of interpreting the shape mapping in the face, then I'm going to be encouraged to build further. I'm defining that as good and not perfect, and thereby somewhat receptive, let's call it, to further development. Nobody can work with drawing without being aware in some capacity of mass drawing. Mass drawing is so important for your development and performance, and yet if you go in and make it exactly what you want it to be, you almost don't want to touch it. It becomes pristine, and you've got to incorporate a breathing space, some kind of accommodating quality in the way that you work the values. So everybody's a bit different in that regard. What I tend to do is to get it somewhat kinetic. I like the word choppy, and I also like the idea of trying to go after these almost accent markers, these elements which give me a certain definitive way of broadly interpreting it, because something that is definitive like that reaches for something over here, and so on and so forth. We could really look at this for the entire evening, and we have in certain instances. It's just for now, I think it's well worth your consideration if you figure out a way to explore how to incorporate breathing space into your drawing, especially early on. It's also, I think, tied into the nature of the artist to change their mind, to change their focus, to adjust their seeing, and to focus on learning from the process, so that the process always has a dynamic, unresolved quality to it, unresolved in a good way. I think sometimes we're looked at as people who can never make up our mind, but we're always trying to grow and improve. And because of that, we're striving with the work at hand to make it better than what it is. I am going to give you some pointers here for those of you who are watching at home and thinking about doing this kind of drawing. I'm going to recommend, as much as it may seem like you've been there and done that before, that you go in and do a periphery value range. And I'm going to start it out by drawing in with a very soft point on my H pencil. This takes us back to our previous dialogue about the visual noise. Yeah, this really puts your skills to the test. Remember that when you're doing these kinds of drawings, you are the athlete who is training yourself in terms of your coordination. You are the coloratura who is doing scales. If you're a basketball player, you got to learn to do layups. You got to practice them. You got to practice long shots. If you're a baseball player, same thing. We are doing this because it deepens our impact in what we're trying to say. And this is no different. This may seem like something that is a little bit too labor intensive, or I didn't sign up for classical drawing to do this, but take my word for it that just going in and practicing an even tonality, notice how I took the paper stump and I stumped perpendicular to the hatch. That's something you could play around with, but it gives you a nice even basis of tone, and it will allow you to have that conversation with yourself about what kind of value you need in here in terms of its qualitative contrast. Are you getting any fuzziness? Are you getting any paper fiber coming through? Are you getting graining where you do not intend to have graining? And these are my two simple values that I work with. All right, so we have that, and I want to also underscore what I said earlier, which is you could work with something like this, the mapping of the darks and the lights. Remember, not shadow and light, but just dark and light. I call it false value. You can do this for 3 hours, 4 hours. Well, I'm going to speed up the process so that I don't do that because I want to take you through some steps and some sequencing. But I want you to just please bear in mind that that's the operating system, if you will grant me that for the time being. What I'm going to try to do with this is work another range. I'm going to divide it into 5 pieces, and I hope that you do the same thing on your paper, in your sketchbook at this moment or at any moment in the process. And essentially, I'm going to go in and recommend now that you find a darkest dark, an anchor dark, an accent, whatever you want to call it, the deepest part of your range. Whatever that is, please begin to do that and go ahead and try it in your sketchbook like we were doing the other day. Remember that this is going to require you not to push down too hard. Some people have issues with that. It's also going to require that you be mindful of the paper and of the point of your pencil, like I was just alluding to a minute ago. So if you go in and you make the point of your pencil too sharp, you may in fact wind up scoring the page. If you make it not sharp enough, it may not give you the right accuracy. It might not dig into the crevices of the paper the way you want it to. But I will start out the process of just laying out that H. Then here's my paper stump. You see how much darker it gets? Because I've got some residual graphite on my paper stump already. Probably B will give me something much, much better. Take your time on this and work gradually down the scale. That is, don't go for a 12B right now. Go for something that is like what I'm doing here, a B pencil. Because sometimes if you go from a hard lead to a really soft lead, it gives you a lot of noise. So my recommendation is that you get patient with this. Also, you may find once you get a little bit deeper that you're becoming more aware of what I was talking about last time, which is it's not about pressure, it's about proximity. If I get into a closer juxtaposition of marks, then I'm liable to get into something that feels very concise, and we want concise, solid values because we have to get in there and articulate as deep a tone, a tonal value as we possibly can in order to anchor the range. Quite a bit different than what we have here, right? Again, we're talking about the amount of graining you want versus the amount of coverage you prefer. So don't rush the process, but my first recommendation is obviously that you go for a darkest dark. I'm going to go as dark as I can get away with. Ideally, if I don't have a camera on me and stuff like that, then I don't have to light my paper as thoroughly. And this may not look like thorough even lighting at all. It could look very amateurish as far as I know, but it's blasting light a lot more than I'm kind of used to in here, which translates into blasting light on the cast. So the less light I have on the cast, obviously the darker the range is going to be. But I want this range to be as dark as possible because we have so little range available to us, we have to capitalize on the maximum. So if you can reach a little bit deeper in some of these areas, go for it, is what I'm saying. And now I'm going to proceed in with something. This is going to be B on top of H, and I'll just alternate back and forth between the two grades. And I'm going to insert this procedurally, sequentially into the drawing and drop the value quite a bit, which will really expand the range of what I have available to me as my first decision, number one decision, which is to find the anchor, to find the darkest piece of the range in here. I want to get wording that has variety to it. I want to get wording that feels like it is provocative in a good way and not so procedural where I'm just saying, okay, go in and make the darkest dark and the middle dark and all that kind of stuff. And I need to have a few words for everything. And so I use tone and value interchangeably. The painters who made great use of this, I would say Abbot Thayer is a great example of a person that made tonal poems, because Thayer made it his business to work in tone. He advocated for tonal understanding. I'd like to work with a teacher and a community that is actually building ideas, in great dialogue, so we can be fascinated with what we do and celebrate it at the same time. One of the people that fits in with this is Edwin Dickinson. And Edwin Dickinson trained with Hawthorne. And so he's a person that went through the color training and decided that he wanted to go in and make these miraculously beautiful tonal harmonies. And it makes me respect him all the more. I read a little bit about Ennis, and he was trying to find his sense of the omnipresence, the creator in nature. His work has the look of that to me. It's like he's depicting something with a kind of spiritual significance. That's how I see his work. Why do you start with the darkest part of the range, aside from the idea of giving yourself the bookends of value? Why don't you go in the middle? Let's say I start with a middle value. What's the problem with a middle value right now? It's too close to the false value, you destroy the terminator. It's too close to the false value and you destroy the terminator. So what you're trying to build for yourself, don't take my word for it, try these different sequencing options out and see what destroys what. But what you need to do is to construct an engagement where you don't undo things that you did which were legit. Like you go in and you really get into this idea of laying out very specific, almost graphically interesting summaries. Don't undo that with a tonality. What I'm going to do next, before I get to those middle values, is I'm going to go to the luminous shadow, the lightest shadow. But that's going to be my second recommendation for you in this particular sequencing option. By sequencing option, I'm talking about strategy. It's about as close as I ever get to a how-to. But I found it helpful because of things like not destroying the terminator. So I'm going to go in here and lay the basis with H pencil on my value range because I want that base layer to fortify itself. And what that does is that gets me into the question of what can I do once I'm no longer concerned with maintaining the same value throughout. Do I have any more muscle out of the pencil? Or am I in danger of wrecking the paper? In the process of exploring this, you may want to also consider not padding the paper. In other words, not having multiple sheets, because the more you use these harder lead pencils, the more you run the risk of giving yourself a kind of hard edge crevice in the page if you have multiple sheets, because it's a softer landing point, if that makes any sense. So I'm going in there. I don't have a ton of room, but I went ahead and pushed on the H pencil a little bit more. And it gets me closer to that, but these are too far away. They're just too far away when it comes to the value. I say that because if I put these tones together and they're too far away, that is, there's too much space between the tonal value in the luminous shadow, the lightest shadow, and the darkest shadow, you know what suffers if that's the case? You only have so much exquisitely precious space to work with. And so what you have to do is you have to get your luminous shadow, your lightest dark, so to speak, as close to your darkest dark as you can live with, especially if it doesn't look like that in nature. Because when you go in and you teach your own students how to do this, you will see them copy the shadow 9 times out of 10, and they will use up a lot of that precious range as they get what really winds up being a totally accurate range in the shadow to work, but then pictorially they run into a brick wall because they realize shortly thereafter that they don't have any range for the lights. So what do we do in the business? We compress the values in the shadow. We get the shadow values closer than they appear to be in order to maximize the range in the lights. That means on this side of the terminator, these things have to communicate a closeness. Again, I use this as a tester. So I put some B pencil on top of H, not as much as I have in here. And by the way, I can always go darker with the anchor shadow with this one here if I need to. I might want to do that. I get a lot of questions about this. People say, well, I see reflected light in there. The first thing I do is I refer back to my teachers who didn't like that phrase, reflected light, and I thank God that I met those people because I agree with them. I feel like you got to find terminology that allows you the wherewithal to see things for what they appear to be. So I usually don't pick up that phrase, reflected light. I usually use reflection. Yeah, so I'm going to go in here and maneuver this piece of the range lower so that I can take it into a deeper spot. I can probably subdivide this in a minute and show you what I'm talking about regarding luminous shadow and reflectivity in the shadow that we talked about a second ago. The other thing that you're dealing with when you're organizing the massing is you're dealing with the read, the way that something appears to your viewer. And the read is a kind of graphic interpretation device. The read is related to, can you see the form and then also depict it so that your viewer picks on what you saw? If you don't communicate the way that you're seeing something, you might be seeing it well, but your interpretation can be problematic. This, you can see, is being maneuvered to a lower setting, closer to that. You see that? As opposed to these. And that's going to be important for the way that the lights are now positioned in order to flourish, because we want a lot of range in the lights. In order to get there, we have to compress the shadows. That is, push the shadows together a bit further than they appear, crush the shadows. But what you wind up seeing in this example right here is there's something in the way that this is being formulated or conveyed that makes the shadows appear way too dark. And that's going to be an important point about this exercise, because the exercise of tonal relationships is about simultaneous contrast. It's one of your most important things. What you have in simultaneous contrast in relation to the drawing exercise is that the lights and the darks coordinate. Everything is in highlight now because it's all paper. And so, of course, the shadows are going to look too dark because the lights of the paper make them so. However, once we get into this area and this area and that area throughout, we're going to darken that down, and that will make the shadows actually appear lighter. What I'm doing now, my third recommendation for you, is to go after the middle light. And I'd like you to put in a middle light that is based, as much as you can manage it, on the H pencil. So I've got 2H now. And I'd like you to drive it in there and cover everything with it. And that's going to take a little bit of elbow grease. Again, the practice of coverage, almost again like paint. And I'm going to put this all over the lights and drive things down. This is what I call the complexion value. And I say complexion because at some point someone tried to pin me down, and they had a good question on what value in the range was I trying to put down. What I'm saying with this description is you have to be very observant and interested in the situation at hand, meaning how light is the light on your cast or your model? Is it a very intense light? Is it one of those things like a 150 watt bulb? Or is it something more like a 25 watt bulb? And if it's a 25 watt bulb or something to that effect, then your complexion value, what I'm creating now, may be quite a bit deeper. Keep it as an open question as you proceed. As I take an intake of the full image and compare the darks and the lights, when I go in and make a middle, I'm just going to drop it, because if I don't have room to articulate a highlight, then I don't have anything. So I'm going to lay this in throughout and then pop the highlight as my fourth value. What kind of artist are you going to be? Because what you're trying to assemble is a way that works for you. This is where this kind of dialogue that we're having and these descriptions, these demonstrations, need to be ultra clear so you can make your own conclusions about the way you want to work. You just have to find something that really fulfills you in a way creatively that just speaks to you. It's the way you want to engage. I am altering the direction of the paper stump versus the hatch coming off the pencil, and the reason I'm doing that is for adhesion. I'd like to push the graphite particles to the fibers of the paper. I am hoping that you can see, I can kind of pick up on the shadows don't look quite as dark anymore. This has been virtually all 2H. Try to get as hard a lead as you can stomach. My tone now has a fair amount of richness, and that's what you want. You definitely want a workable value, because this is another issue we have in the industry, is that people get into the value range and they don't know how to use it. And we want to be able to use the variety in through here. So if you get to a point where you have achieved the richness, but you don't feel like your shadows are clear enough, you may have to go back into the shadow shapes and reinforce them, which is certainly a possibility. It's feasible that repositioning that is potentially a very good thing for you. Second thing is, how do you know if your middle tone is going to read well or not? And I have a very simple system for discerning that, and that is to then go in and articulate the lightest light. If the lightest light shows up well enough in my drawing, then I know I've got at least the beginnings of a decent tonality. So I'm going to go in and articulate a few lightest lights in here, and I can kind of see them. Again, if I don't see them well enough, then I can go back to the middle light and adjust that. So my middle light becomes my test for my lightest light. And I'll just show you this because, again, let's assume that I'm just not getting the right read in the highlights, and I need the highlights to pop more. So what I do is I drop the middle, and when I drop the middle, the highlights show up more, which is very interesting. The middle value going darker pops the lights. It's a game of simultaneous contrast. And I've always felt like the analogy that I want to bring to the table is the one of the guitar player, my brother, who had at some point a Marshall stack, so you can imagine how difficult it was to sleep in the same house as my brother. But that's a whole nother story. What I remember is he didn't just pick up a guitar when he got home from work and start playing. What's the first thing a guitar player does when they pick up a guitar? They tune it. What he did is what I'm trying to do here, which is to take the pieces of the range, I look at them almost like strings on an instrument, and I'm tuning this more toward the bass so that I can pop the middle string here. And I can take what I was going to go after up in this region, which is the socket, and maybe go after a little bit of a differentiation in the projected shadow, which is, again, sort of about looking at the string of that, the darkest dark, the bass string. And if I can drive that into a place or into a position which gets it deeper, I'm hoping that the result is that the places that I don't treat up in here wind up looking like reflection. I hope they do. And you see, it is beginning to happen a little bit, isn't it? I'm actually creating reflection without lightening anything. A game of simultaneous contrast. Is very interesting to think about that. How much discussion are we having about light direction? Zero. How much discussion are we having about texture right now? Zero. So you don't have to go in and try to tame the beast or reinvent the wheel. Just take things as they come, one at a time, and separate the issues. To me, this is a big question of comparative value and of trying to get that materiality of graphite, paper stump, and eraser, and paper itself to work into something that you can learn from. You should make a process which leads to different questions. If it doesn't, then you may have to reevaluate your process. And one such question might be, why is one of the darkest darks so high up on the piece? And you would say, well, probably because it's closer to the light direction, and you're going to get a lot more contrast up here. Stuff like that, where you don't have to deliberately kind of push on the drawing to go in certain directions. It's just your process should naturally unfold into additional places where your mind goes that it hasn't been before. And when it's doing that, I think you're going to feel far more fulfilled with your process, and it'll be enjoyable and idiosyncratic at the same time. Going into an area like this one and underscoring it and reinforcing it without improving it would be a wasted opportunity. And so there are always places to go where you can go in and graphically reinterpret what's happening, and that's exactly what I'm doing here and what I would recommend. The next one is the last one. Obviously, it's the darkest light. Again, not a good word, not a good phrase, but something that really should get you thinking, because this is where everybody drops the ball. This is where everything goes sour. All the hope that you had at the beginning of the drawing falls into disarray. Sorry. But it's also a very special value. It is, in terms of the formal definition, it would be a halftone. It would be the darkest part of the light range. It's the part where you really get the humanity of the figure coming through. It's also the most difficult part, I believe, to orchestrate because you're running right up against the terminator and you're trying to understand where it's going. For the time being, I'm just going to go on a search for whatever pattern of darkest light I can find, which meanders its way through the design. It connects things and bridges elements. I like talking about it this way because I don't think this is too complicated for anybody. I think anybody can do this. I just want this kind of a discussion to be so ridiculously simple, it's like dumb simple, that you can see exactly what I'm doing, because ultimately what I want you to be in the position of is not tripping over value, tone, whatever you want to call it, as I did. It took me a while to figure it out, but I've got it figured out now. It doesn't bother me ever, and I don't want it to bother you either. The hardest one is the darkest light. It's the one that really gives you the figure and more the, as I say, the humanity in the piece. And it's really the one that also gives you the nuance of the light direction. And we could talk about that at a later date. I will not talk about that right now. I just want to get in here and place this as much as I can and let the dialogue go where it's going to go for the night. You see how that marker right there, which is part of the darkest light, adds something to the cast? This is going to take a while when you try this out, when you try this at home, because you're going to have to build it up. If you build it up too quickly, you're going to have to take it away. It's kind of good to build up a darker value with a harder pencil, because you really get into that idea of the specific tone. The other thing that's kind of nice about the process for me, sequentially, in recommending this, is I'm going to go after what I observe first. It's kind of like shoot first and ask questions later, right? So I'm going to go in and say, I observe that as a phenomenon that fits into the puzzle piece, to the map of the darkest light. And if it doesn't work later on, I can shift things away from that. Notice I didn't say fix it, repair it. I said shift things away. And, in that regard, it keeps me focused on the business at hand, which is to coordinate the tonal relationship as best I can by pure comparison. So you see me going in here, and I'm just, again, cleaning up, reinforcing that shadow shape, because now the shadow shape, which you can see I'm maneuvering a little bit darker toward the anchor here, is going to give me some clarity on the part of the range that's coming out of that. I should say the darkest light. This part here is shadow and light, and now we're in between the shadow and the light, and that's where I'm essentially in a study like this just going to stay. I'm going to stay in between the shadow and the light and see if I can clarify where the shadow is going to exist, just as a piece of shape, aesthetic shape, and sit on it for a while. And I'm going to do that here and see if I can bear down just a little bit more on what I think is going to be legitimately the shadow shape, and continue to pursue that, get that to group together with these parts of the shadow shape, which are needing to be definitive, isolated, and they are. And they sit in places that feel like I could give them a bit more treatment. Again, isolation. I don't have anything worked out just yet, but I don't need to be in a place where this is looking like it's a masterful job or something. I just want to be clear with those values. That's the lesson. Just be simple, clear, and purposeful, determinative about the way you go in and make the value range. It's one thing to have a value range, as we all know. We've done value ranges before. It's another thing entirely to figure out a way to practically insert it into a drawing. That's what I'm kind of going after with this lesson. Approaching it in a way that seems procedurally sensible without it being overbearing or rigid. You don't want that. The important thing for me is I can make absolute clarity out of all these pieces, these little mosaics. Whether they do the job ultimately, it's going to take a lot more time, but that essentially is the lesson. So it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's premature to go to planes right now because I haven't finished this opportunity, this intrigue on shapes. There's a lot that needs to be organized about where these things are. You get into stuff where they relate, there's rhythm to them and stuff like that. I said what I had to say, and It's not a complete drawing, but I appreciate everybody's time and patience, and I hope it was clear tonight. It's a good discussion to have, and I hope something that was thought-provoking for all of you. And again, I really appreciate you being here, and I want to make every opportunity that we have to have a discussion, whether it's one way or not, beneficial for you. Thank you one final time for your presence and enthusiasm.